In the early 1990s, I was at a conference for the heads of independent schools from New York and Connecticut on how technological breakthroughs, many of which then were just over the horizon, would radically change the way in the future we would live our lives and educate our children. Technological advances are constantly taking place at a dizzying pace. And think about this. This is over 30 years ago. I don't think any of us then had even heard of the internet, and I know that I had never sent an email. And now, can you even imagine life without the internet, email, and texting? And I'm keeping my eye on all of you right now. But according to the keynote speakers at this conference, what was coming would create far vaster changes, not only in the way we lived, but in how we perceived reality. Some of the scarier ideas that I heard had to do with machines with consciousness and machines with the ability to genetically program fetuses so that couples would be able to select their yet unborn child the way we now shop for a car, ticking off genetic options. Well, those scientists really were not wrong. Artificial intelligence and genetic programming are now a reality. But for me personally, this whole event was steeped in irony because at this conference, I was a throwback. I had been asked to lead a workshop on the role of faith in a secular age, one dominated by science and technology. And I actually gave a very brief presentation as my purpose was to facilitate a discussion among the heads. But I began by saying that faith, as it always has been, is the response to questions neither science nor technology, no matter how sophisticated, can answer. Questions of meaning, like, where does the universe come from? Is there a God? Why am I here at all? What are the sources of meaning, well-being, and joy? How should I live my life? What will happen after I die? Well, not surprisingly, even for those intellectually sophisticated heads of schools, that was the question that generated by far the most interest. What will happen after I die? What about you? Have you ever had that question play across your mind? And it's a particularly significant question for us to be asking today as we're approaching in just 3 days on Wednesday, the Feast of All Saints. For on that day, All Saints, we remember the Christian belief that everyone who dies in faith is alive in the Lord, and that through Jesus, we are in community with them. We call it the communion of saints, which joins together the living and the dead. And that's what we mean in the liturgy when we say, joining our voices with angels and archangels and with what? All the company of heaven. That's why All Saints is part of our liturgical life. But you know something interesting? As I studied about All Saints, I was surprised to discover it was not officially adopted by the Roman Catholic Church until the late 9th century. And I found myself asking, well, what did they do about this for the previous 8 centuries? And for me, it begs a question. Although nobody can know exactly for certain, there's a scholarly consensus that the celebration of All Saints began in medieval Ireland, in the Celtic Christian church. And their practice was actually rooted in an ancient pagan belief that there are two worlds. One is the physical world, the one in which we live, the world of sense, perception, and rational thought. But according to the Celts, there is also an invisible spiritual world inhabited by both spiritual beings and the souls of human beings who have died. So our Celtic ancestors believed that when a person died, his or her spirit passed into that invisible realm. And there's a great gulf of perception separating these two worlds. Yet the ancient Celts also believed that there were certain times of the year when these two realities, the separation of the two realities, became tissue thin. So thin, spiritual beings could pass from their realm into ours, and we could look into theirs. The time of year when these two worlds came together was later dated as November 1st. And when the Celts became Christian, they simply transformed their pagan holiday into the Christian feast of All Saints. Does that bother you? Does it bother you that in the coming days we'll be celebrating the Christianizing of a pagan festival? Well, it should, only if having a Christmas tree and hunting for Easter eggs is equally bothersome for you. For those are also pagan remnants we've incorporated into our practice of Christian holy days. But you know this, All Saints isn't really very significant in American life, is it? You know, I bet that 75% of the churches in this county won't even mention it over the next 2 weeks. But the ancient Celtic belief that this gulf between the physical and spiritual world became tissue thin at this time of year has become a major American holiday in a completely secular way. The event, of course, is a word that comes from the Old English All Hallows Eve. Building our Christian practice on what was good and true in pagan belief doesn't bother me in the slightest, nor did it bother our Celtic Christian ancestors. Because biblical Christians have always maintained, it's true, there are two realms. One is the world we live in, the physical world of sense perception and rational understanding, and the other is a spiritual world, a realm of spiritual beings in intimacy with the Lord Himself. And Christians have always affirmed that the spirits of human beings who die pass away, pass over to that other realm to live in intimacy with God as they await the resurrection. Of course, to believe this is a matter of faith. We can't perceive this reality with our senses. We cannot see, hear, touch, or taste that spiritual realm. And neither can we discover it through rational deduction or induction. And trust me, technology is of no help. no email passes between the two realms. But for those of faith, there are times, multiple times, when that gulf becomes tissue thin. I had my Christian conversion in 1971, and I became part of a group that was called the Madison Prayer and Praise Community. We were all ex-hippies. Other people called us Jesus freaks. And believe me, we were like God's shock troops. You would not have wanted to spend 10 minutes alone with me in a room back then, because you would have left emotionally bruised and battered. I was all hard edges, because in the Madison Prayer and Praise Community, we firmly believed that we were the only real Christians probably in the whole world. We were critical of everybody because only we were the true believers. After going to seminary in California, I went back for a conference in Madison a few years later, and I wanted to see some friends from the prayer and praise community. And the only one I could find was probably our most unique member. He was a Roman Catholic priest named Jim Egan. He was a charismatic Jesuit and assigned to lead the Catholic Student Center at the University of Wisconsin. And when I finally tracked him down and went to his office, he was actually on his way, vested, to go celebrate a Mass. But he said to me, "Come on along with me." And he even asked me to read the lessons. He introduced me simply as a seminarian from California. Afterwards, a young man approached me and said he was struggling with a vocation to the priesthood, and he wanted to talk with someone who was already in seminary. Now, trust me, the irony of this was not lost on me. Not only was I not Catholic, I was married. But I agreed to have a chat with him. So we went outside and we sat on the grass in front of the Catholic Student Center, right at the foot of Bascom Hill in Madison, the heart of the university campus. Hundreds of students were flowing back and forth around us. And for about 45 minutes, we talked about a vocation to the priesthood. And when he discovered I wasn't Roman Catholic, it didn't faze him in the least. And when I had to leave, I got up to say goodbye, but he grabbed my hand. And he said, "Wait, before you go, please, let's say the Lord's Prayer together." So I did. And we sat down in that place, saying the words of that most familiar of all Christian prayers. And I suddenly found myself conscious of the fact that those were words that had been said by tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions upon millions of men, women, and children of faith all across history. At that very moment, I realized there are thousands, if not tens of thousands, of Christians all over the world at that moment who were also saying those very same words. And it was as if our voices were being drawn into the voices of the entire communion of saints. And beyond that, I suddenly became very conscious of the fact that every one of those men, women, and children were beloved of God. They were all saints. It was an experience that completely transformed the way I related to other Christians. For the first time, I clearly understood that Jesus' love embraces everyone, who puts her or his trust in him. And this understanding eventually led me to the Episcopal priesthood. And ultimately, this is why we celebrate the Feast of All Saints. I mean, it's just a particular day set aside for remembering. In it, we acknowledge that the pagan Celts were both right and wrong. Well, they were right. There are two worlds. One of those worlds cannot and never will be known through science and technology. So faith will always have a place even in the most technologically sophisticated world. But what the Celts didn't fully realize until they became Christian was that this gulf, this chasm between the two realms becomes tissue thin, not just in late autumn, not just around Halloween. For those who have faith, the transparency, the thinness is not rooted in time or place. It takes place, it happens every time we celebrate the sacraments. When you receive the bread and wine of communion, the Lord himself is present. And with him is the whole communion of saints. In the moment of baptism, the Lord himself is present, and with him is the whole company of heaven. Those we have loved who have passed over before us are present with Jesus. This is what we remember as we approach the Feast of All Saints. In the Eucharist, in the baptism, heaven and earth meet. And that, my beloved friends, may be the most deep and the greatest of all Christian miracles. Amen.